My soul is a sacrilegious temple in which the bells of sin and crime, voluptuous and perverse, loudly ring out revolt and despair. Renzo Novatore, toward the creative nothing. Every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided within itself falleth. Luke 11:17.
Let us therefore trust the eternal spirit which destroys and annihilates, only because it is the unfathomable and eternally creative source of all life. The passion for destruction is a creative passion too. Mikhail Bakunin, The Reaction in Germany.
Part 1. A Gift of Fever. Deathspell Omega names not merely a band nor a collective of artists, not just demiurges of cacophonous black metal, nor simply philosophically and theologically subversive concepts. It signifies not a definite order of hermetically sealed doctrines nor something describable in anything less than confusion and paradox. The name Deathspell Omega denotes an indefinite gesticulation towards an abyss of seething potential, a communication of that which should not be, conveyed through a total aural and intellectual agony that simultaneously dredges the primordial labyrinth of unintelligible chaos and scars the summits of human abstraction. Deathspell Omega is a striving for actuality, a channel for an unspeakable encounter which lays waste to worlds.
Deathspell Omega is rebellion.
A rebellion as total and inescapable as the one found in their work puts God to death by internal subversion, forcing theology to blacken itself, to show its teeth in the face of a sovereign violation of the divine law. In so doing, the diabolic is similarly brought to a peak of intensity through the mimesis of a world already ensnared within the diremptive logic of the death of God, a world which has forgotten its enmeshment within the matrix of divinity and given itself over to the profanity of everyday projects. Such a forgetting entails, in dialectical fashion, that the edible specter of the absent prime architect re-emerge in the world in phantasmagorical form as its own internal subversion, as the ground it expels from itself, as the impossible, the satanic. The god of this world is therefore knit up, low-biding in big cities, a nihil operating within dispersed cultural memory, ritualized and immanent.
God is nothing if he is not, in every sense, the surpassing of God, in the sense of common everyday being, in the sense of dread, horror, and impurity, and finally, in the sense of nothing.
Such a negativity is not a pure absence of existence, an abstract privation. It is rather an amorphous potency, at once a striving for being, and the possibility of being's complete devastation. This is the flattening of God, his immanentization, his degradation, his becoming other. God surpasses himself insofar as he becomes what he is not.
Dost thou still stand in undiminished majesty after the exinanition of divine attributes, the face of profound fire gone astray?
At the precipice of the total negation of worlds, we find the horizon of the possible which gives way to the impossible, or the disallowed terrain. In the thought of George Bataille, the confrontation with this limit, and fidelity to its infinite procedures of internal dismemberment, is a sovereign act, an act of anti-utilitarian excess, of evil, and a groundless suspension over the abyss in which a single moment reveals the cacophonous silence of eternity within time.
The stillness of contemplation is allowed in billions of woeful cries, so astonishingly simultaneous and in unison. Each and every second, they diffuse each other in such a perfect manner, equaling the most inscrutable of all silences.
Such an experience ruptures the fabric of hegemonic order from within and creates something new. In short, sovereignty and evil are the conditions of the sacred. For Deathspell Omega, the sacred is opened by willingly conjuring the wrath of God upon oneself, with subsequent perception of the protracted activity of malign spiritual manifestations through subversion of the divine and human alike, as it appears in the world of homogeneous production and utilitarian banality. Deathspell Omega sacrifice is, therefore, the sacrifice of everything existing. By this very token, it is also a representation of the scorched earth upon which this species, knowingly and unknowingly, builds its altar to the forever festering wound. And it is here, in the streets, the gutters, the blood-soaked furrows, where the divine derelict lie wounded and chastised, that the means for resistance is born. What indeed is the meaning of the death of God, if not a strange solidarity between the stunning realization of his non-existence and the act that kills him? To kill God is to liberate life from this existence that limits it, but also to bring it back to those limits that are annulled by this limitless existence as a sacrifice. Michel Foucault, Preface to Transgression. Blessed are the rebels, for they shall reconquer the earth. Arturo Giovanniti, The Sermon on the Common. Part 2. Summa Divisio.
A bond of hallowed essence between all that pulsates. It is the primeval degradation, the erosion, the crumbling, the everlasting scission. It is disturbance and anxiety as absolutes, for the world is becoming.
One of the first definitions of evil to gain global traction via Christianity was that of privatio boni, or the privation of being. First defined by Augustine of Hippo and later by St. Thomas Aquinas, privatio boni theory is predicated first upon the supposition that the God of Christianity was the source of goodness by virtue of the fact that God just is goodness itself, as well as its inextricable corollaries, truth and beauty. Taken together, these three, truth, goodness, and beauty, are called the classical transcendentals. This metaphysical statement, derived from the work of Plato, comprises the backbone of Christian ethical theory in the medieval period. The second pillar of the privatio boni framework consists in the nomination of evil as a predication made of any person that is deprived of the goodness of God, or of any action that undermines the work of God through creation, and averts one's focus from the things of heaven down towards the material world. The second pillar therefore relies on a concept of human freedom. That is, very simply, the ability to will and actively pursue ends contrary to those of God as he reveals his ends through the world and the church. Evil on this view is not a thing, it's not a substance, not a pre-ontological formless chaos, it's merely nothing at all. To will and act out evil, according to this framework, is ultimately to will and act in favor of nothingness and the destruction of one's ties to the divine. The main challenge to this view would come from Germany, through the work of idealist philosopher Friedrich Schelling, who felt the privatio boni theory to be insufficient to the task of addressing the evil and suffering of the world. Evil must not be merely a dry logical negation, rather evil must be something, the force of negation itself. Under these conditions, Schelling intuited evil to be the movement toward the base, original, dark and chaotic ground of nature, the world, and even of God himself. In Schelling's monumental work, Philosophical Inquiries into the Essence of Human Freedom, the absolute is divided in itself. This division within the divine makes possible an anti-God force within the divine absolute and, with free human action, actualizes evil in man. The reason for evil is therefore due to the most sacred condition of all, freedom. Human freedom, whether manifested as evil or as the good, is precisely a transposition of the split within the absolute directly into the heart of man. The freedom to will evil is thus a sacred right, as it is to will the good, but only mankind wills evil. Evil is not a possibility for God, according to Schelling, due to his nature as the good, yet that from which both God and human freedom spring are one and the same, what Schelling called the unground, the abrasive swirling murk of primordial potentiality, and what George Bataille would later atheize and immanentize by calling base matter or base material. Quote, "The logic of base materialism is that whatever is elevated or ideal is actually dependent on base matter, and that this dependence means that the purity of the ideal is contaminated. The dependence of the ideal or the elevated, the high, on base matter, the low, and the contamination this produces is systematically denied by the ideal, which splits off base matter as whatever is disgusting, vile, subhuman, etc. In this way, it hopes to keep base matter in its place as the base, but the splitting off can never be completely successful because base matter is at the basis of the ideal and the higher values." End quote. Benjamin Noyes, George Bataille's Base Materialism. Evil has the peculiar property of simultaneous excess and absence. It is an excessive freedom resulting from the chaotic primal ground of the divine, and by this very token, it's also the act of negation which wills the absence and dissolution of God. It's this very logic that sees the external imposition of form and domination as stasis, stultification, and the death of freedom, and yet, the ultimate form of human freedom, the ability to will evil, is both destructive and constructive, constrictive and liberating, oriented both towards life here and now, and yet towards death, insofar as this is the end result of morally aberrant actions. Evil is the actualization of that which God cannot enact, yet that which is most intimate to the divine even in its suppression. Human freedom, then, is the condition of possibility of the sacred, by being the condition of the impossibility of God. Yet freedom is still constricted by mundane moral valence in this system. A true freedom would not lie in a mere opposition to norms, but in the destitution of the entire edifice of moralism, which is to say, the symbolic structures which create our individual and cultural identities. Could we find a dialectical interplay between evil as privation and evil as unground, which could move this interpretation of Deathspell Omega's art into new territories that delineate a fresh perspective on freedom? And if so, in what is it grounded? What does it presuppose? And what are our possible sources in Deathspell's corpus? Part 3. A Ray of Darkness.
Everything except God has in itself some measure of privation. Thus, all individuals may be graded according to the degree to which they are infected with mere potentiality.
Privation theory is based upon the absence of the good, which is identical with God. But if God himself becomes nothing to us through a sacrifice of him, or through his death on the cross, then the world itself could be said to be evil par excellence, a liminal state of non-being parading as being. Evil on the unground theory is still not a substance, it's a virtuality, the coruscating power of the negative, instantiated as essence through act, identified as the abyss of possibility at every moment undergirding the world. It is something, not nothing, yet this something is a force of negative and or opposing manifestation rather than an object in itself. Evil is therefore no mere abstract privation but a determinate, active negation of the totality of hierarchical being, manifesting a space within meaning and sense where meaning and sense break down. Evil, then, is not a moralistic category, but an amoral or transmoral process that retains the moralistic connotations only because the experience of this process is as disruptive as what we typically associate with radical moral evil. Quote, "I imagine myself covered with blood, broken but transfigured and in agreement with the world, both as prey and as a jaw of time, which ceaselessly kills and is ceaselessly killed." End quote. George Bataille, Visions of Excess. The sacred then is not a separate realm, but rather the revelation of this absent presence and this present absence at every moment latent within experienced reality. The rupture, the act of breakage, is the sacred itself, the point of communication, of apocalypse, an eminence open via negativa by virtue of the act of the negation of the hierarchy of being. How should we approach a definition of the sacred if not by way of hypostatic division, i.e. the experience of radical rupture, itself a reverberation of the originary rupture within the absolute that is necessary for finite life? This is the complete dislodging of the person from any unity or certainty that would anchor them. At the same time, it's the experience of the impossibility of the dissolution of the person into the one precisely because the person remains alive and separated from, yet still a witness to, death.
No voice shall answer to my probe and throbbing prayers, but certainty and madness write in ashen letters.
The sacred is the experience of the bare, irreducible, transcendental being that one is, yet still a being suspended over the abyss of contingency, or of chance. It reveals the unbearable singularity of one's frail existence, but one which stands as a point of possible communication, a nexion between all things. Following the sacred to the end then entails remaining faithful to the force of death as a principle pervading both microcosm and macrocosm. What then is the sacred if not an inversion of God from within his very creation, ushered in by those whom he links to himself by destiny? Quote, death and the instant of divine intoxication merge when they both oppose those intentions of good which are based on rational calculation. And death indicates that instant which, insofar as it is instantaneous, renounces the calculated quest for survival. End quote. George Bataille, Literature and Evil. Here, in order to dialectically connect privatio to unground, we should reflect on another concept central to Deathspell Omega, that of divine law, or phos. Part 4. Perendea cadaver.
Thy flesh is nothing but a receptacle for law ironclad, ever since thy volition sunk into the deepest of abysses.
Negativity appears in that crucial dialectical moment known as the negation of the negation. Here, the negation of the negation signifies a negative moment of thought that retains all of its disruptive power, but one that can be seen as a positive condition for identity. Negativity as such has a positive function. Crime, a form of transgressive evil in relation to the law, is not seen from this dialectical perspective as merely a negation of the law, but rather as an integral and positive condition of the law itself. In the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek's 2014 work Absolute Recoil, we encounter a similar conception, in which the negation of the negation should be thought of as a failed negation, a negation that draws consequences from the first failure, providing it with a minimum of positive content. We're formulating the example of crime and law through this alternate definition. Crime might be thought of as a failed negation of law, and law a failed negation of crime. A negation that never fully succeeds, but that through its failure reveals how the law must sustain itself through brutal activities that are themselves, when performed outside of the domain of the law, criminal. The law is thus only brought into being when it is first broken, which is to say, the law is the first of all crimes.
The commandments shall sanctify the reign of the spectre that gnaws upon man.
In assuming the burden of sin, transgression against the laws of God and culture, the method of George Bataille is geared towards a mutually assured destruction of both the sinner and the law against which he transgresses. Sin, or transgression, includes failure, in that the sinner does not simply assert his subjectivity over and against the law. Rather, the law shows its teeth, so to speak, and his apparent goodness constitutes its own opposite, wrath and retribution. The transgression of its own moral limits in the service of a supposed upholding of justice reiterates and enforces the law's claim to power and dominion.
Therefore, God honors the sword so highly that he calls it his own ordinance, and will not have men say or imagine that they have invented it or instituted it. For the hand that wields this sword and slays with it is then no more man's hand, but God's, and it is not man, but God, who hangs, tortures, beheads, slays, and fights. All these are his work and his judgments. Pleurosis, answering the strident call of felony, filling the void of purity, gone instantly.
Thus, while the subject is broken and put down by the power of the law, so too is the law shown to be always already broken internally. This internal rupture does not affirm the groundedness of the law, but rather the false or arbitrary unity which it claims for itself. The law is shown to be irreconcilably inconsistent with itself, and this inconsistency, or self-contradiction, is the very condition upon which the law depends, thus rendering necessary and self-justified any and all attempts to cement its ill-founded legitimacy.
The world of yore is unintelligible unless God conceived history as the history of the crimes and misfortunes of the human race.
This movement of transgression, law, punishment, breaks the wheel of the law and exposes it as a veneer of fantasy. We are thus shown two things. First, the basis for our notions of good and evil, reality and non-reality, are founded on an inconsistent void at the center of all existence, thought, and morality. This void is precisely that which Bataille explicates as operative in inner or mystical experience. Second, though this methodology of transgression appears to be on its surface the instantiation of a suicidal death instinct, it goes beyond this. There is actually a second negation of the negation going on within the process of transgression, insofar as the thirst for annihilation fails to completely annihilate the subject. Rather, what occurs is a positive moment in which the individual is broken by the law, and the internalized restraints of identity placed upon the individual annihilate themselves through the law's self-negation. This propels the subject towards the groundless void from which all things spring. That's to say, into the heart of darkness, into the split absolute. This leads to the moment of revelation, wherein the diabolic function, rending the law asunder, shows the law for what it is.
The paths you tread are the sons and daughters of the wound that festers forever, the wound whose pus nurtures everything, the wound whose pus nourishes all.
This is not a direct experience of God himself, but rather of the ontological delirium resting at the heart of the world. It is an experience of freedom through slavery, salvation through perdition, and the opening of avenues of creation through universal destruction. The recognition of these paradoxes is the foundational condition for true subjective identity.
The idea of God is pale next to that of perdition, but of this I could have no inkling in advance.
Thus, the individual experiences the nonsense of being, which can only be understood by a turn to the immanent and base logos, as it appears within the world as violence and opposition, a logos which happens to be the negation yet ground, or the ungrounding ground, the great destroyer of the Christian logos, felt as a spirit of flame.
Degraded holy essence, the third hypostasis. Unaltered holy essence, the third hypostasis. De profundis clamavi ad te, Domine.
The spiritual and material effects of such a confrontation manifest themselves in the world to consciousness through the uncovering of self-opposition within the Absolute, within God himself, as expressed through the form of the law. So, to touch the void is to experience the critical spasm, the rupture, that moment at which man's ground gives way, opening onto the madness that is the disunity of being. One does not touch God in this delirium, but rather his possible absence through the act of negation. This interplay is the ontological Gordian knot which man's systems of thought, meaning, and hierarchy attempt to cover, lest a confrontation with it break him forever. Continuous attempts at taming the primal power of negativity, of repressing agonizing rupture, in the service of God, state, capital, or ideology, will therefore be forever tied to the logic of the law, and thus to its self-immolation and murderous justifications.
Your civilization is merely a fleeting attempt at taming the beast, as you cannot fend off that ageless urge. How sly you are to channel it instead.
In other words, There is an inherently diabolical structure resting at the heart of reality, which shows itself most prominently in those systems which attempt to shield it off. This is the return of the repressed, and to realize this is to be irreversibly broken by the world of the possible and the law it requires, and therefore to proceed on the path towards the rupture.
The idea of salvation comes, I believe, from one whom suffering breaks apart. He who masters it, on the contrary, needs to be broken to proceed on the path towards the rupture.
This void born of negation is the distance of man from God in the form of radical freedom. God shows himself to us as irreversibly rent asunder most clearly in this place where ground and unground, law and crime are forced into an unveiling of inverted and repressed interdependence. The embodiment of this act of negativity in man is the first inkling of the meaning of the knowledge of good and evil spoken in hushed tones beneath a tree in that old garden. What, then, is the height of gnosis, if not the understanding of this horrid unification of divine opposites?
The depths of abjection, a throne of manure. But even during the ecstasies of beatification, it is by no means possible to separate them. The den of serpents, the knot of vipers, corruption bred, and the blazing spirit of the mystic heaven above. Angel browed with brass wreathed by a halo, sublime and infinite, tunneled by vermin.
Part Omega. And the light was like the stroke of a scalpel.
Omnis humana cogitatio in fundamentis putrefactionis conditor, cum ecclesia Domini nostri e praeposuit.
And so we end at the beginning. Through the logic of law, we arrive at its founding myth, the fall of man. Through this fall, a hideous gnosis is made our inheritance. The prospect of the awareness of the fatal division within God, of the originary Edenic misprision, and the lustrous darkness radiating from the scars of abandon and election. Yet it is not enough to say, as we've argued, that the knowledge of good and evil bestowed on man operates according to the moralistic bivalence traditionally promulgated by dogmatic churches and states through history. These are still the remnants of Eden, attempting as they must to conceal the underlying horrible truth, that truth itself is the horrible. Quote, "The serpent promises Adam and Eve that by eating the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they will become like God. And after they do so, God says, 'Behold, Adam has become like one of us.'" Hegel's comment is, "So the serpent did not lie, for God confirms what it said. Cognition is the principle of spirituality. It is in this principle of cognition that the principle of divinity is also posited. Subjective knowledge is not just the possibility of choosing evil or good, it is a consideration or cognition that makes people evil, so that consideration and cognition themselves are what is evil, and that therefore such cognition is what ought not to exist, because it is the source of evil." End quote. Slavoj Žižek, Absolute Recoil, page 141. The constitutive wound at the heart of reality is therefore to be understood as cognition proper, which emerges from the vortex of limitless drive. This act of scission, of contraction, rends the absolute irreparably wounded, rent between ground and unground, reason and its self-undoing. The unground is that which is split off from the reasoning God in the very act of his being, yet functions as the means of his continual genesis. It is then the division within the absolute which is replayed as the ever-present origin within each act of human cognition, a rift transposed into the fabric of being, making thought itself possible.
Your action can only be contemplated like a well of nihilism. Those who will observe it too closely will drown their spirit. Because of your creations, only the flesh has assimilated the laws. Substantial consciousness.
Truth, then, at its most primordial, is the realization that thought's condition of possibility, always operative and everywhere discernible, is dissociation, or division. Dissociation or division is the act of violence which wrests one from Eden, from oceanic ignorance, and is felt most acutely in the transgression of a law yet to be made manifest. But as we've learned, law is always already broken in the decisive act of its existence. Dissociation via transgression is simply a mystical disunion of the human from his own ignorance as regards the law, and of the law from itself. Such scototropic radiance bears a light which blinds the eye, it liberates the heart, and opens perception to the tyrannical presence of God within the temple of the mind. To a God who traces sanguine scars along all particular acts of cognition in their infancy, dead to sin before they are ever manifest to consciousness, each mind a massa damnata.
Cognitive activity. God comes to be known in ways that originate in God solely.
Should we take Schelling's proposal that evil is not an abstract negation of a concept, but an enacted negation of a determinate reality of ground, of logos, then evil as a privation of the determinate good, the principle of ontological hierarchy, may plausibly be understood as privatio, taken to its limits, and reinstated as the force of the unground at work in man. Thus, the sacred is inherently tied to subjectivity as revelation, apocalypse. It is the communication of the incommensurable chasm between finitude and the eternal silence from which all things come, of that eternal silence latent within subjectivity, that is to say, the nothingness or negativity that defines it. And it is this nothingness, this negativity, in short, cognition itself, that renders man the imago Dei, the image of God. Thus, the truth of the word, dependent as it is upon reason and cognition for its meaning and sense, is always duplicitous, concealing in its dazzling splendor that self-inflicted wound surpassing it, which connects it to man, manifested as the blackened sun over Golgotha.
The essence of revelation lies in the fact that it is the direct speech of God to man.
Yet the subject is excessive, is beyond continuity by inherently negating it, by becoming the abyss within reality, channeling the unground by becoming like God, like nothing, thus praising through action the Deus ignotus, which surpasses God. The sacred, then, is the return of the infinite which confronts the finite subject, the revelation of the suppurating wound in the heart of subjectivity which all our efforts strive to ameliorate, bury, conceal, and repress. All such efforts fail, however, as death is to the finite as the unground is to God. Death, then, is the condition of possibility for all things. Quote, thus the trace of aboriginal death harbors an impossible demand for organic life. It is the trace of a trauma that demands to be integrated into the psychic economy of the organism, but which cannot, because it expresses the originary traumatic scission between organic and inorganic. The organism cannot live the death that gives rise to the difference between life and death. The death drive is the trace of this scission, a scission that will never be successfully bound or invested, because it remains the unbindable excess that makes binding possible. End quote. Ray Brazier, Nihil Unbound, Enlightenment and Extinction. Religion conceives of revelation on human terms. It attempts to give the rupture a transcendent weight. On our conception, however, the sacred is the destitution of these efforts by the realization of the transcendental facts of finitude and death, i.e., those facts which act as preconditions for mortal human life as such. Yet, as is clear from the work of Deathspell Omega, it can be experienced and channeled in the creativity that follows an opening of the chasm of possibilities only after the destruction of the abyss of what is considered possible in the current order. This is a participatory theology of the sacred and the organic via an original inorganicity, death, within the organic, thus rendering the sacred the impossible horizon which gives rise to possibility as such. It is therefore death which plays the fundamental role in the constitution of the subject, and evil is the aperture opening the horizon of the sacred. That which does not participate in this laceration is that which dwells in the fantasies of the religion of progress and blithe humanism. To experience the sacred, however, also forces one to see that following this blackened path without understanding the nature of enantiodromia, of the conversion of one thing into its opposite, will inexorably lead to the same voracious fire.
The act of a free man, connected to the balance of the world, projects itself into the infinite. But the fracture, its ontological ballast, the dispersion and the overcoming bring a harvest of increasing conflict, a descending spiral of splinters lacerating the meridians.
The fracture is the difference between the organic and the inorganic, ground and unground, and the traumatic trace of this difference is what life itself cannot live. It is the constitutive wound of the subject who is himself a negativity. This wound of God, within and between man and God alike, the death that is our life, is that by which we experience our divinity. The sacred is that liminality within which our identity is confronted and rent between two orders, the ground and the unground, the finite and the infinite, identity and disillusion. If flesh cannot inherit the kingdom of God, then this is our place, blinded, suspended, and left for dead. One to be known and apprehended precisely by first unknowing, through the ecstatic rupture gifted by the blinding light of the Deus absconditus. To the mysteries of knowledge, the scent of an old book.
To resistance, no matter how vain.
To sacrifices with the taste of rotten blood.
To comrades, never to be forgotten, and lest we forget the holy dead.
To the blinding light of Lucifer, blinding the eye and liberating the heart.
To the veil between divinity and man, the devil.
To the abhorrent lord of this earth, hearken to the long defeat.